Afghanistan continues very much to be on the agenda of the international community, but it's really the issues that seems to be of interest, that it's political transition and its security. And for different reasons, human rights, the legacy of war crimes, the legacy of past and present human rights violations, there's no connection made between these violations and the current political and security situation in Afghanistan. For me, and I also know for the colleagues who are speaking here today, and certainly for many of you, that link between the political crisis, between security and violations is very obvious. The Afghanistan Analyst Network is an independent research organization, and we've been that I helped establish in 2009, and we work very broadly on political and security issues in Afghanistan. For us, that also includes human rights and justice issues. Patty Gosman and I wrote a report for AAN maybe half a year back, that looks at transitional justice in Afghanistan. Partly looks at the kinds of violations that have happened in Afghanistan from the late 70s until today. It also looks at what's been done for transitional justice and what's been done on the reconciliation side. This report we call the report "How Will This End?", which I think is a very appropriate title for a report looking at transitional justice in Afghanistan. What's interesting is that this report still almost tops AAN's list of most read documents for the past 6 months, which for me suggests that even if there is not a real sort of political policy interest in these issues, there's certainly a lot of people that recognize that the current state of impunity in Afghanistan is not conducive for stability, and that in the long term something needs to be done to promote justice in Afghanistan. We are in quite good company. I know that all of us have our different stories for why justice is important for Afghanistan, but I wanted to raise 2 very recent examples. One is just a couple of weeks back there was a press release on a Taliban website that was very critical against the Western media's attention to the Taliban killing of civilians in Afghanistan. And what this press release said was, well, you focus on when we kill civilians, but you never look at all the Taliban fighters that have died. You never speak about the Dasht-e massacre in 2001, when thousands of Taliban fighters who had laid down their arms were killed. And so there is a sense of grievance. There's a sense of we have also been violated, and nobody looks at what happens to us. There was also, I think many of you have read the recent interview with President Karzai that he did for the Washington Post, where he spoke about why the relationship between the Afghan government and the United States had soured. And what he emphasized was it's all about the Afghan civilians that have died over the past decade, and what he called neglectful attitude of the Americans towards Afghan civilian suffering. And both of these examples they are emotionally convincing, but obviously also a little bit biased in their presentation of the truth and biased in their presentation of the facts. But they do show that violations and grievances do fuel violence, and violations and grievances can serve as a justification for violence. And it's, given these examples and the many others that we could have, I think it's really surprising that promoting and ensuring justice has not been viewed as a key to the transition strategy or to stabilizing Afghanistan. I think there's a few reasons to why it's been so difficult to get a justice agenda started in Afghanistan. Partly it's the length and the complexity of the conflict. Most groups have some issues that they are, or some events that they prefer not to talk about. So it's difficult to come together and build a sort of coherent narrative about the conflict and a coherent agenda to work for when it comes to justice issues. Another important factor is that regional and international actors have always had an interest in and been involved in the conflict in Afghanistan, and that means that also a particularly key international actors like the United Nations and the United States have not been pushing for transitional justice very forcefully in Afghanistan, rather the contrary. So as the result, we've had a sort of process over the past 12 years where most key processes have ignored justice elements. For example, the ongoing reconciliation process does have elements of justice. There's this idea of grievance resolution, of people should be able to come forward and tell what has happened in their communities when reintegration and reconciliation happens. This has completely been ignored, and that's recognized in some of the evaluations of the APRP process. And when it comes to what's actually been done for transitional justice, we've had a few very important moments. We've had, most importantly, 2004, the Human Rights Commission published a report that's called the Call for Justice report. Most of you will know about it, where they did consultations in Afghanistan asking people, what do you want? What have you suffered, and what would you like to see happening to those responsible for violations? The findings of that report were very clear. We want accountability. If we can't get accountability, we want people removed from power. As a result of that, the Afghan government actually adopted an action plan, but an action plan that today remains largely unimplemented. The one institution that did a very big job was the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, that over the past 5-6 years has been doing a major documentation exercise on war crimes in Afghanistan, covering the period from 1978 to 2001. This report has, as far as I understand it, been ready for almost 1 year. It remains not released, and I think some of there's several stories about why this report is not being released, and I think part of them is about lack of high-level political support inside Afghanistan for the release of this report. So I think what you are doing here today, and the fact that you are specifically trying to get discussion going around the death list, which I know that Patty will talk about in detail, is very important. So what I'd like to sort of conclude with is, if we look at the situation to now there's there is a continued interest in Afghanistan. There's no real interest in transitional justice. And there's not that many evident ways, or even if intellectually and emotionally the issues are linked, politics, security and justice, it seems to be very difficult to get these issues combined into action. So what I think we can do today is, one, start focusing on the issues where there is support. One of the areas where there is still, where there is a fair bit of support and engagement is on issues relating to ongoing war crimes and the ongoing killing of civilians in Afghanistan. This is something that engages the Afghan government, it's something that engages many of the international actors in Afghanistan. I think this is, one should build on this and continue pressuring and reviewing the policies of international and Afghan forces, and also engaging with the insurgency on the issue of civilian casualties. And I think it would be important to try to make an end to civilian casualties into a confidence-building measure in possible peace talks in Afghanistan. So if you are serious about peace, start with not killing civilians. That would be a way to move forward. I know it's not an easy decision for the Human Rights Commission or for anybody who's involved to release the Human Rights Commission's conflict mapping report that covers violations from 1978 to 2001 in Afghanistan. I think it would be very important to get this report out in the public space. I think it would be important because it wouldn't, in this situation, it would not be easy, that's for sure. And it would need very developed communication strategies so that the release of such a report actually is conducive to reconciliation and doesn't divide Afghan society even more. But I personally think that not releasing such a report can be equally destabilizing. So I'd really encourage those who can to push for the release of the conflict mapping report. Finally, I do think that those of us who are outside Afghanistan, who are not permanently in Afghanistan, who have the possibilities to travel back and forth, actually have a very big role to play. And here, on the one hand, I think the Dutch Prosecutor's Office and institutions like the International Criminal Court are very important for pushing for some accountability, actually showing that, yes, you don't get away with, at least not the worst war crimes. But I also know that in order to manage accountability measures, it's really important that there's also a different kind of mobilization. And that mobilization does have to come from Afghan victims, and partly from, for now I think, from the many Afghan victims in the diaspora, who can, I know it's probably not very easy, and probably also many of your organizations are just as divided as organizations are inside Afghanistan, but for us who on the international side try to push for justice issues in Afghanistan, it's really key that we can continue to show that there is a demand for justice and that there is a continuing mobilization and that people are ready to tell their stories and engage. So that's what I wanted to do, is to give a bit of a picture of what has happened so far in order for my colleagues to come back on some of the details. Thank you.
questions, please write them down or tell them to me in the break, during the break. Then now I will give the floor to Mrs. Patricia Goffman. And she is an independent researcher and consultant on human rights and rule of law issues, and especially in related issues in Afghanistan.
Thank you. And thank you all for inviting me to this. I'm very glad to see this event happening. When the list was published last fall, I was really hoping that this might signal a moment of increased advocacy on the part of the Afghan community here and elsewhere in Europe, and I hope that will be true. I want to talk about a couple of things related to the list. First of all, I think it's useful to think about what is the importance of lists like these. We know in this case, we've already noted, this particular list represents just a fraction of those killed in that particular period of time. But at least it puts names to what have previously been numbers. I, among with others who have written about this period of war, we have used estimates, numbers that have come up in different books and reports over the last 3 decades without any sense, except for beyond a few that were known, of how these related to actual individuals. And the more that we do that, we bring that human face, that the family, the suffering, that particular act of disappearance entails, it gives the true importance to a list like that. And it acknowledges not only that these people disappeared, but rather that they disappeared at the hands of someone, in this case a state, a government. This was not just the inevitable losses of a war, but a deliberate act carried out for a purpose by people who were in power at that time. Such lists also, I think we need to look at them as, I just wrote a piece for the Afghanistan Analyst Network about a different kind of list. The list of the 5,000 is a particular list that reflects the bureaucracy of repression at that time. That's an account that was created by those actually carrying out the detentions. But there are other kinds of lists that have emerged. One that I came across in the last several months concerned a later period of the war. It was a list constructed by human rights activists collecting information from families who were seeking some help in trying to track down their loved ones who disappeared, this time in the fighting in Kabul in the 92 to 95 period. In this case, these were mostly young men, some older, who'd been taken by one side or another, one militia group or another, because of their ethnicity, because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because that was the nature of the fighting at the time. That's also an important kind of list. There could be so many more lists like this. We don't know how many victims of disappearances, summary executions, atrocities of this kind, looking over 35 years of war, and yet the actual documented history of that war remains so thin. Sari mentioned the conflict mapping report of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, which, had it been published, would have been the first time so many Afghan voices talking about the history of this 35 years of conflict and the loss experienced by so many families. It's still, though, only 8,000 interviews, more or less, which gives you a snapshot of that conflict, but it's still a small piece of the whole. Unlike many other conflicts, where they're, not all, but many which have a certain level of documentation about what happened. There are journalists reporting, human rights organizations, other organizations keeping track of what happened over the course of the conflict. Afghanistan, particularly in the early years of the fighting, had little of that. And every effort since has been an effort at trying to reconstruct that period, to try to build on the knowledge of people talking about what happened and putting together the pieces until we have a picture closer to the truth. Without that, we're all in the realm of guessing. We say 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people disappeared. this group did it, no, that group did it, he did it. Without solid, really thoroughly documented information coming from as many different sources as possible in order to reconstruct that history, we can't really move forward because we don't have a firm grasp on the truth. So this is, I guess, my plea in sort of moving forward, is that this is a critical component and sometimes an overlooked component in the pursuit of justice. We can ask for justice, but if we don't have that element of truth building up to it, we don't have the means to pursue justice. Let me give you an example from a trial you will have been familiar with, the trial of Commander Zardad in the UK back in 2004-2005. I'm sure some of you were following it at the time. It was one of those situations which you quite hear this kind of expression about, that everyone knew what Commander Zardad had done. He was a notorious figure. He was a famous figure. His checkpoint near Sorobi on the road between Jalalabad and Kabul was infamous for people being stopped and having their goods taken and otherwise being attacked and traumatized, and imprisoned and abused or killed. Everyone knew, but everyone knows is not sufficient for a prosecution. You have to go beyond that to get the hard evidence, the documentation. The first trial of Commander Zardad in the fall of 2004 failed. The jury could not reach a verdict. The evidence collected from, I don't know how many witnesses, at that moment was insufficient to convince a jury. And that's what it takes to convict someone. You have to be able to convince either a judge or a jury that the evidence is conclusive, that it is sufficient for what you're trying to prove. In that case, it didn't happen. It took a second trial and more detailed accounts and more thorough pursuit of other victims and eyewitnesses and testimony to build that case and end up with a successful prosecution. Everyone knows what happened is not sufficient. To get to the truth is a critical part of the pursuit to justice. If we look at some other countries, Argentina, for example, I've been reading quite a bit about it because of a course that Sari and I are teaching. As you may know, it's been a very long struggle in Argentina after a war in the 70s in which maybe 30,000 people, maybe more, were forcibly disappeared. A very slow process to get to prosecutions, and an initial process more to get to the truth. The Truth Commission that was held, that was the first stepping stone on that process. Later, truth trials held to compel the government to reveal what it knew about what happened, even if they weren't going to be able to prosecute anyone for it at the time. Now we're still seeing prosecutions take place, again, almost 35 years after the conflict in Argentina. It's a slow road, but it rests on that accumulation of fact and testimony and truth from the very people who suffered. Outsiders can't supply that. It has to be the people who experienced those atrocities, the survivors, the relatives, the loved ones, who can build those cases and fill in the gaps so that we know what happened. So if I have a plea to everyone here, is to seize that moment with the publication of the list and see that as a beginning. We need to still do that. There are too many gaps in our information to be able to do what we'd like to do, is to bring all those responsible to justice. But it relies on the testimony of people like you, people that you know, the networks of Afghans across the globe who lived through this period, who have the information necessary to reconstruct the truth of these terrible periods so that ultimately justice can be done. Thank you so much. I hope this is the beginning of something.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gosman. Now I'd like to ask Mr. Berger to take the floor.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me first introduce myself. I'm a prosecutor with the Netherlands National Prosecutor's Office. And I work with the International Crimes Unit of the Netherlands Prosecution and with the International Crimes Team of the Netherlands Police. And colleagues of mine are here as well. Mr. Bert-Jan Tjeerd of the Netherlands Police. He has a great deal of experience in conducting investigations in Afghanistan and in Afghan cases. And my international legal expert, microphone of the prosecution's office. We are all Dutch civil servants, and we work on behalf of the Dutch state. We investigate and prosecute crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, enforced disappearances, and genocide. That's the scope of our work, the subject of our investigations. And if there is a sufficient Dutch link to the crime, we will conduct investigations and we will prosecute. And a sufficient link may be that the crime was committed inside the Netherlands, or that the victim has Dutch nationality, that the suspect has Dutch nationality, or either that the suspect is present, and just only present in the Netherlands. He falls within our jurisdiction. So much for the introduction, and regarding the death lists, the subject why we are present here, let me share a few words about how we discovered those death lists in our investigation and our decision to go public with them. We started investigations in 2010 into the involvement of the former chief of the interrogation department of ح.د.خ.ا, the Afghan security service at the time. And this man was suspected of having committed war crimes in Afghanistan in 1978 and 1979. Under his responsibility, people were arrested, interrogated, and tortured. And the methods that were used included beatings, electricity, and sleep deprivation. Some prisoners were released after power changed hands within the communist regime, and many others are known to have been executed. And during the course of our investigation, we found so-called transfer orders. And I saw them in pictures on the screen. And these transfer orders were published in a book by Miras Vardak in 2000 or 2001. And his book contained copies of these documents, transport orders, made up by the Afghan state security services in those years 78, 79. And they concern the transfer of persons to and from detention centers, such as the Polycharki that I saw here in other pictures. And the transferred persons are mentioned by name in these documents. We spoke to this Mr. Vardak, and Gert-Jan obtained the original transfer orders. And they were put to forensic research. We compared handwriting, we did research into the ink that was being used, and we could validate the authenticity of those documents. And the signature of our suspect, the head of the interrogation department, is on a number of those transfer orders. And in these documents, detainees were described as Muslim fundamentalists, intellectuals, students, civil servants, military officials, shopkeepers, or just short Ashra. The police also found and contacted witnesses in Germany. And these witnesses mentioned the existence of death lists. And we were familiar with them from beforehand. But one of these witnesses, a 93-year-old woman from Hamburg, turned out to be in possession of 154 pages of those death lists, listing the names of people who, according to the then Afghan authorities, were executed in 1978 and 1979. And that's how we found valuable documentary evidence, which is usually so scarce in the investigations we conduct. And talking to witnesses, Afghan witnesses, it became clear to us that many victims and relatives did not know of these death lists or the transfer orders. And seeing these documents, some of them obtain certainty about the fate of their relatives or friends for the first time. When the suspect died in 2012 and the investigation ended, we were left with these documents. And we asked ourselves, what should we do with them? It was clear that they were so valuable to so many Afghans. And we decided that we had to share them. To make the information about the fate of these victims of the Afghan communist regime, public and accessible to their relatives and friends. And after doing so, we got much response. Emails and telephone calls from Afghans all over the world, mostly thanking us, sometimes criticizing us for interfering in Afghan affairs, or for allegedly singling out crimes under the communist regime. And in a few cases, offering us new information on the involvement of others residing in the Netherlands in other crimes. And that's information that might help future investigations. And on that note, I would like to finish. To start investigations, we need information. And that's where the international Afghan community comes in. If you have direct, accurate, and well-founded information about anybody residing in the Netherlands, having been involved in war crimes, torture, enforced disappearances, or crimes against humanity, you can get in touch with us. Because anybody who has committed international crimes and stays in the Netherlands can, under certain conditions, certain legal conditions and restrictions, be held accountable for those crimes. And it's our job to look into such information. And if such information offers sufficient basis and the crimes fall within our jurisdiction, we can start an investigation. And again, it needs to be direct, accurate, and well-founded. And in that respect, the Afghan community can help us do our job. I would like to follow up what Mrs. Grossman said. If we want justice to be done in Dutch courts, we need to find the truth first. The truth can only be established in a Dutch court on the basis of sound and solid evidence. And that's what we try to find. Thank you so much.